The morning mist is still sitting low over the valley. It's just past 7, and you can't see more than a few meters in front of you. Around you, tens of thousands of men are standing still, waiting. You can hear breathing, the occasional clink of armor. Somewhere behind you, a conch shell lets out a long, low sound. And then the mist begins to lift. What follows is not what most people picture when they think of samurai. There are no lone warriors facing each other across an open field. No elegant sword draws. No slow, deliberate duels between two men testing each other's resolve. What you're looking at is something far more complicated. A landscape packed with organized formations, forests of long spears, the distant crack of matchlock rifles, and the low thunder of drums setting the pace of an advancing line. This is the Battle of Sekigahara, October 1600, and by the time it ends 6 hours from now, roughly 180,000 men will have fought across this stretch of land in one of the most consequential battles in Japanese history. So what did a samurai battlefield actually look like? Not in the movies, not in the paintings, but in reality, on the ground, with real men, real weapons, and real consequences. The answer, it turns out, is both more organized and more chaotic than anything popular culture has ever shown us. Let's start with who was actually there, because this is where the first misconception tends to surface. Most people think of a samurai battlefield as a place populated entirely by samurai, the elite warrior class of feudal Japan, trained from childhood in the sword arts, bound by codes of honor, and serving their lords with absolute loyalty. And while samurai were certainly present, they were never the whole picture. Samurai came from warrior families and spent years developing their skills in swordsmanship, archery, and horsemanship. That part is true, but they functioned as part of a much larger military structure, not as isolated actors. For much of Japanese history, the professional soldier class made up the core of any fighting force. Over time, though, particularly from the mid-1400s onward, armies began drawing in men who weren't warriors by trade. These were farmers, laborers, ordinary people who picked up weapons, fought a battle, and then returned to their fields when it was over. They were called Ashigaru, and by the height of the Warring States period, they were the backbone of almost every army on the field. So the image of a battlefield filled with gleaming samurai in perfect lacquered armor, each one a master of their craft. That was never quite the reality. The reality was a mixed force. Trained warriors alongside part-time soldiers, organized into formations, fighting under commanders they may never have personally met. And if you enjoy thinking through history like this, the gap between the myth and what actually happened, it's worth subscribing. There's a lot more of this kind of thing on this channel. Now here's the question that tends to surprise people most. If samurai were on the battlefield, what were they actually fighting with? The easy answer, the instinctive one, is the sword. The katana, that long curved blade that became the defining symbol of the samurai identity. But on an actual battlefield, swords were largely secondary weapons. They were there, yes, but they weren't what battles were won with. The dominant weapon of the Japanese battlefield was the spear, known as the yari, long, practical, and devastatingly effective when used in coordination. Spears gave soldiers reach and collective striking power that no sword could match at scale. Foot soldiers were trained to fight in dense, tight formations called yaribusuma, essentially walls of spear tips moving as one. If you were advancing on that line or defending against it, you weren't thinking about elegant sword technique. You were pushing, holding, trying not to break the formation. Under generals like Oda Nobunaga, these spear formations became increasingly disciplined. Nobunaga, in particular, had a talent for seeing the battlefield as a system, not a series of individual encounters. His armies moved with precision. Ashigaru pikemen formed the front lines, their spears extended, their job not to demonstrate individual skill, but to hold and press when ordered. Before the spear came the bow. Archery had long been central to samurai identity, and archers played a significant role in the earlier periods of Japanese warfare. A samurai skilled with a bow was considered a serious threat long before any close-quarters engagement began. Arrow volleys shaped the early moments of many battles, disrupting formations and forcing opponents to commit before they were ready. But then something arrived that changed everything. In 1543, Portuguese traders landed in Japan and brought with them matchlock firearms, guns the Japanese would eventually call Tanegashima, after the island where that first contact happened. Within a generation, the weapon had spread across the country with remarkable speed. And by the time Nobunaga faced the Takeda cavalry at the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, firearms had become a decisive force on the Japanese battlefield. What Nobunaga did at Nagashino is worth pausing on. He arranged his arquebusiers, his gunmen, in 3 rotating lines behind wooden palisades. As one line fired, another reloaded, and a third prepared. The result was a near-continuous wave of gunfire that the famous Takeda cavalry charge simply couldn't survive. It wasn't the guns alone that won the day. It was the organization behind them. This wasn't random. It was a deliberate system, and it worked. By the end of the Sengoku period, the long era of civil war that defined much of the 15th and 16th centuries, Japan had accumulated hundreds of thousands of arquebuses. Armies of close to 100,000 men were not unusual. The battlefield had transformed from a place where individual skill and personal combat mattered most into something that looked, in certain ways, closer to early modern European warfare. Large organized forces, combined arms tactics, disciplined volley fire. Many traditionalists within the warrior class resented this. The gun, some argued, was dishonorable. It allowed a foot soldier with minimal training to kill a warrior who had spent decades perfecting his craft. The skill gap, in other words, became almost irrelevant. But the generals who refused to adopt firearms on principle tended to lose. And losing, in the Sengoku period, wasn't just a defeat. It often meant the end of your clan entirely. So pragmatism won out, and the gun became a standard part of almost every serious army. What's fascinating, though, is how all of these elements, spears, bows, guns, cavalry, swords, fit together into a larger structure. Because the samurai battlefield wasn't just a collection of weapons and men. It was a managed system, and understanding that system changes how you see everything else. The basic building block of a Japanese army in this period was a unit called a sonai, which translates simply as formation. Think of it as the equivalent of a regiment in European terms. A sonai typically held between 300 and 800 men, and it wasn't made up of a single type of soldier. It contained all of them: archers, spearmen, arquebusiers, heavy infantry, cavalry, and the samurai who led them. Combined arms in a single unit, operating together. The arrangement within a sonai was deliberate. At the very front were the ranged units, gunners and archers who could engage the enemy before any physical contact. Behind them stood the Ashigaru pikemen, dense and ready. Further back were the samurai retainers on foot, and behind those, the cavalry who could respond to shifting conditions or exploit a break in the enemy line. Logistics and supply units sat at the rear, and the commander himself generally positioned in the center of the whole formation. Close enough to respond to developments, protected enough to keep functioning. Larger armies were simply multiple sonai, operating in coordination, which raised its own challenges. When you have tens of thousands of men spread across a valley, how does a commander control what's happening on the flanks? How do soldiers in the middle know when to advance? The answer was signals. Flags in distinct patterns and colors were used to communicate across distances. Drums set the rhythm of movement. Conch shells, that low, resonant sound from the opening of this video, carried orders over the noise of battle. Individual soldiers and Ashigaru affixed small personal banners called sashimono to the backs of their armor, which helped commanders and officers identify their own men in the chaos. Each detail, each piece of equipment, served a practical purpose. None of it was decorative. Before any of this could begin, though, there was the preparation. And that part of the day had its own structure. A lord preparing for battle would receive a specially prepared meal, something considered appropriate for the occasion, a ritual in itself. Then his attendants would dress him piece by piece in his armor. The process was careful and methodical, each layer fitted in a specific order. Once he was ready, he would face his men and call out, a shout of, "Glory! Glory!" And his generals would answer back in confirmation. A priest would offer a blessing, and then, surrounded by his banners, the Lord would lead his army forward. It's a quiet image against the scale of what was about to happen. One man in armor, calling out to thousands and thousands answering. The ritual wasn't empty ceremony. It had a function. It grounded everyone in the same moment, reminded them of the hierarchy, and created a shared point of departure before everything became loud and dangerous and hard to track. And it did become loud. Very loud. What battles actually looked and felt like once they began is something history gives us only partial windows into. But those windows are revealing. The early part of a battle often involved ranged fire. Arrows first, then guns were available, each side trying to disrupt the other's formations before closing the distance. The sound of arquebuses firing in rotating sequence would have been constant, punctuated by the low thrum of bowstrings and the higher noise of arrows landing. As the two sides closed, the spear formations came into contact. And here is where the battlefield shifted from organized to something more difficult to describe. The decisive moment in many Sengoku period battles was simply two large spear formations pushing against each other, each trying to break the other's line. Men packed together, spears overlapping, pushing with their whole bodies. It wasn't elegant. It was physical, exhausting, and dangerous in a way that had almost nothing to do with martial artistry. This is also where the tension between the ideal and the reality became most visible. The samurai ethos prized personal honor, individual achievement, the idea of standing out, of being recognized. And that impulse, even in the middle of a coordinated battle, kept pulling men away from the plan. At the summer siege of Osaka in 1615, Ronin troops fighting under the Sanada clan simply ignored orders to hold their position and surged forward on their own, driven by the desire to earn distinction in the fighting. The chain of command bent under the weight of individual ambition. So even with all the planning, all the formation work, all the signals and banners and coordinated tactics, battles still had a way of becoming something closer to organized chaos. Both things were true at once. The structure was real, and so was the disorder underneath it. If this version of history, the one that doesn't fit neatly into the familiar story, is something you want more of, dropping a like on this video genuinely helps this channel keep making it. There's one more aspect of the samurai battlefield that almost never makes it into popular portrayals, and it's among the more difficult parts of the history to sit with. When a battle ended and victory was secured, the work wasn't over. The heads of high-ranking enemies were taken. This was not random brutality. It was a structured practice with a specific purpose. A warrior's value after a battle was measured in part by what he could prove, and bringing back a notable head was the clearest proof available. The identity of the fallen had to be verified, which meant presentation mattered. The women of the victorious court would prepare those heads, combing hair, applying cosmetics, mounting them carefully, before they were brought before the Lord. He would review them, identify the fallen, and then distribute rewards, honor, gold, land, titles. The warrior who took the first head of a significant enemy was singled out for particular recognition. The ritual was grim, but it had an internal logic. It tied battlefield performance directly to reward, creating a system of accountability in an era where surveillance was impossible and word of mouth was unreliable. This practice also says something broader about how the samurai class understood warfare. It was never purely about the fight. It was about what the fight produced: status, recognition, material reward, continuity of your lord's power and your own. The battlefield was a place of violence, yes, but it was also a place of career-defining consequence. It's worth stepping back for a moment and tracing how all of this evolved over time, because the samurai battlefield wasn't a fixed thing. It changed, sometimes slowly, sometimes with striking speed. In the earlier Kamakura period, individual combat genuinely did carry more weight. Samurai would announce themselves before engaging, calling out their names, their lineage, their accomplishments, as a way of establishing the stakes of the encounter. Fighting an unknown foot soldier was not the same as defeating a named warrior from a recognized family. Identity and status were woven directly into how combat was initiated. By the Sengoku era, that had largely given way to the mass coordination we've been talking about. The scale of warfare had simply grown too large for individual announcement to make sense. What mattered now was the unit, the formation, the timing of an advance or a retreat. Command systems, communication networks, logistics. These became the real determinants of who won and who lost. And then, in a final turn that almost no one anticipated, the fighting stopped entirely. When Tokugawa Ieyasu consolidated power after Sekigahara and established the Edo period in 1603, Japan entered roughly 250 years of internal peace. The samurai class, built for war, suddenly had no wars to fight. And rather than disappear, they transformed. Many became administrators, scholars, bureaucrats. The sword remained symbolic, but the battlefield faded into the past. Warriors who had spent their lives preparing for combat spent the rest of those lives managing tax records and civic functions. It's a strange ending for a warrior class. Not defeat, but irrelevance through stability. The very success of the political order they helped create made their primary purpose obsolete. There's something worth carrying away from all of this. Not just the facts, but the shape of the story itself. The samurai battlefield was both more organized and more human than the version we tend to inherit from films and games. It had structure, clear hierarchies, deliberate formations, carefully designed communication systems. But it also had everything that structure struggles to contain: personal ambition, fear, the pull of honor over practical sense, men making decisions in the noise and heat of contact that no general could predict or fully control. The katana wasn't the main weapon. The lone warrior wasn't the main story. The Ashigaru standing in a spear line, a farmer who would return to his fields if he survived the afternoon. He was often the difference between a battle won and a battle lost. The samurai's identity, polished and romanticized over centuries, was only one thread in something far more layered. What stays with me about all of this is a quieter question than the one we started with. Not just what the battlefield looked like, but what it meant to stand there, knowing the structure around you might hold, or might not, knowing that the outcome of the next few hours would determine your lord's future, your family's standing, your own place in whatever came next. That weight is something no formation could organize away. And maybe that's what makes this history still feel worth thinking about. If this sparked something for you, a question, a detail you want to dig into further, leave it in the comments. There's a lot more to explore here, and the conversations in this community always take the story somewhere interesting.